Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is April 26th. On this day in 1913, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Phagan was found murdered in the basement of the National Pencil Company in Atlanta. What followed would become one of the most controversial, racially and religiously charged trials in America's legal history: the arrest, trial, and eventual lynching of Leo Frank, the factory superintendent. Today, we'll talk about how this case exposed deep divisions in the American South and reshaped conversations around due process and anti-Semitism in the United States. Let's get started. Saturday, April 26, 1913, was Confederate Memorial Day in Georgia, a state holiday. 13-year-old Mary Phagan traveled from her home in Marietta to downtown Atlanta to collect her pay, $1.20, from the National Pencil Company where she worked inserting metal tips into pencils. Because of a brass shortage, Mary hadn't worked the day before, but she arrived between 12 and 12:10 p.m. to pick up her pay from Leo Frank, the factory superintendent. And that was the last time anyone saw her alive. In the early morning hours of April 27th, Newt Lee, the night watchman at the factory, discovered Mary's body in the basement. She had been brutally beaten and strangled with a cord that was still wrapped around her neck. Her face was battered, her clothing was torn, and her body showed signs of having been dragged across the floor. Whether a sexual assault occurred remains debated to this day. Near her body were two crumpled pieces of brown paper containing handwritten notes. The notes were filled with misspellings and incoherent phrases. One read, "A long, tall Negro black did this. I went to make water," end quote, suggesting someone was trying to direct suspicion toward a black man. Newt Lee was initially arrested and interrogated, but police quickly focused their attention on Leo Frank. He was a 29-year-old Jewish businessman from Brooklyn with a degree from Cornell and 5 years of experience managing the pencil factory. Investigators found Frank's demeanor suspicious. He seemed nervous and evasive during questioning, and they claimed there were inconsistencies in his timeline. The pressure on Atlanta police to find Mary's killer mounted quickly and was driven by sensational press coverage and growing public outrage. Detectives began looking more closely at the factory's internal staff. Among them was Jim Conley, a janitor with a criminal record who had been caught washing a red-stained shirt days after the murder. Conley initially denied any involvement, but then later gave several conflicting statements. In his final affidavit, he claimed that Leo Frank had murdered Mary Phagan and then asked him to help move the body to the basement. He also said that Frank dictated the two notes found beside Mary's body and that Conley wrote them as a cover-up. Despite the inconsistencies in his story, and despite Conley's own record of theft and lying to police, his testimony became the prosecution's central piece of evidence. Physical evidence tying Frank to the murder was lacking, but the prosecution tried to portray Frank as a sexual deviant who preyed on young girls. Meanwhile, Frank maintained his innocence. He said he had given Mary her pay and then resumed work. He claimed that on the day of the murder, Jim Conley had been drinking and hiding in the factory, a detail that aligned with what Conley later admitted. Nevertheless, just 2 days after Mary's body was discovered, Frank was arrested. His Jewish heritage and his northern background fueled the public's suspicion. He was seen by many as an outsider. He was a symbol of elite industrial power in a southern city that was still grappling with its post-Civil War identity. The trial of Leo Frank began on July 28, 1913, and it took place in a tense, sweltering Atlanta courthouse. Frank's defense team, led by Luther Rosser and Reuben Arnold, faced an uphill battle. Outside the courthouse, large crowds gathered daily, and cries of "Hang the Jew" were reported in the streets. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution's case leaned heavily on Jim Connolly's testimony. Connolly claimed that Frank had propositioned Mary, and when she refused, he killed her. He said that Frank then enlisted his help in moving the body and crafting the notes. The prosecution argued that only someone close to the crime could know certain details, which they claimed Connolly had shared. Frank's defense team tried to undermine Connolly's credibility, highlighting his criminal record, his contradictions in his testimony, and the implausibility of his entire story. They argued that Frank had no motive and pointed to evidence that Connolly himself was the more likely suspect. Still, the atmosphere was hostile. Media coverage fanned public sentiment against Frank, and anti-Semitic rhetoric went largely unchecked. After weeks of dramatic testimony and a fever-pitch trial, the jury deliberated for just a few hours. On August 25, 1913, Leo Frank was convicted of Mary Phagan's murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Frank's legal team immediately began filing appeals. They argued that the trial had been tainted by public pressure, biased media, and a mob mentality. Appeals to the Georgia Supreme Court and eventually the U.S. Supreme Court were all denied. However, many prominent Americans began to take up Frank's cause. Journalists, academics, and even former President Taft voiced concern over the conviction. Articles and essays appeared in national newspapers questioning the fairness of the trial and calling attention to all of the anti-Semitism. In June 1915, after reviewing the case in detail, Georgia Governor John Slayton commuted Leo Frank's sentence from death to life in prison. In doing so, Slayton said, quote, "I can endure misconstruction, abuse, and condemnation, but I cannot stand the constant companionship of an accusing conscience," end quote. His decision provoked outrage. Riots erupted in the streets of Atlanta, and an armed mob surrounded Slayton's home. He had to flee the state under military protection, and his political career was effectively over. Then, less than 2 months after the commutation, on August 16, 1915, a group of about 25 men from Marietta, including a former judge, sheriff, and other prominent local figures, broke into the Milledgeville prison where Frank was being held. They then kidnapped him and drove him over 150 miles through the back roads of Georgia. At dawn on August 17th, they hanged Leo Frank from a tree near Mary Phagan's childhood home. Souvenir photographs of the lynching were circulated, and no one involved was ever charged. The group dubbed themselves the Knights of Mary Phagan. Frank's lynching shocked the rest of the nation. Editorials across the country condemned it, but in Georgia, many celebrated it as justice served. The Leo Frank case became an early turning point in American civil rights history. For the Jewish community, it was a traumatic awakening to the dangers of anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League, founded in 1913, made Frank's case its first major campaign. It also fueled the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, which held a cross-burning ceremony on Stone Mountain, Georgia, just months after the lynching. For decades, the Frank case was shrouded in silence, particularly in Georgia. But starting in the 1950s and 60s, civil rights activists, historians, and journalists began to re-examine the trial. In the 1980s, Alonzo Mann, Frank's former office boy, came forward with new testimony. He swore in an affidavit that he had seen Jim Connolly with Mary's body the day of the murder, but had been too afraid to speak out at the time. Based on this new evidence, the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles issued a posthumous pardon to Leo Frank in 1986. However, they didn't declare him innocent, only acknowledging that the state had failed to protect him from mob violence. The story of Mary Phagan and Leo Frank has been the subject of books, films, and even a Broadway musical, Parade. It remains one of the most studied legal cases in American history. The murder of Mary Phagan was a tragedy that devastated a family and a community. But the rush to judgment, the influence of mob mentality, and the role of anti-Semitism in the trial and lynching of Leo Frank turned it into something more. It turned it into a national reckoning. Even more than a century later, the case continues to challenge how we think about fairness, truth, and the rule of law. Thanks for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!